On a hill above the ruins of Carthage, two generals stood 2,089 years apart. Both said almost the same 5 words to the men standing behind them. Both went back to their quarters that night and wrote one small thing in private about it. Neither spoke much about it ever again. This is what they said. This is what happened to both of them afterwards. Spring of 146 before the Common Era. The 3rd year of the Roman siege of Carthage. On the high ground outside the walls, in the smoke of a city being taken street by street, a Roman commander watched the burning. He was about 39 years old. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, grandson by adoption of the Scipio who had broken Hannibal at Zama 56 years before. The family burden had reached him. Rome had voted, in the language of policy memoranda, that Carthage must cease to exist. The defenders had been fighting from the rubble of their own houses for 6 days. A Greek named Polybius stood at Scipio's elbow. He was a household tutor, a hostage by birth, a historian by inclination. He had agreed to record what he saw. He saw the Roman general turn his face away from the city, and he heard him say a passage in Greek, from memory, from Homer's Iliad, about Troy. Polybius wrote it down later. The passage is one of the few private moments in the ancient world we can almost hear. 2,089 years later, in the spring of 1943, a different general stood on what historians believe was the same rise. Below him, in the late afternoon light, were broken stone foundations, low walls, the trace lines of what had once been streets. He wore the brown gabardine of a United States Army Major General. He had 2 ivory-handled revolvers on his belt. Not pearl, he corrected anyone who said pearl, sometimes sharply. He had walked up the hill alone, leaving his staff at the cars. His name was George Smith Patton, Jr. He was 57 years old. He was studying the ground the way a man studies the face of someone he believes he has met before. Patton had taken over the United States Second Corps from Lloyd Friedendahl in early March. Friedendahl had been removed after the rout at Kasserine Pass in February. The order had come from Eisenhower with Marshall's signature behind it. The American Army in North Africa had been humiliated by Rommel's Africa Corps in its first major engagement of the war. Patton's job was simple, in the way orders sometimes are. He was to make the Second Corps into something an enemy would not consider laughable. He was given roughly a month to do it. He had used the month. By the first week of April, the Corps had fought at El Guitar and held. Rommel, by then evacuated to Germany on health grounds, replaced by Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, was being pressed from both sides. The British Eighth Army under Montgomery moved from the south. The Americans pushed from the west. The Tunisian campaign was approaching its endgame. Patton handed off command of the Second Corps to Omar Bradley around the middle of April, so that he could begin planning the invasion of Sicily. The visit to the Bursa Hill happened somewhere in the brief window between the handover and his departure for Algiers. His staff records are not unanimous on the date. Some accounts place it in the first days of May, after Tunis itself had fallen. The exact day matters less than what he did when he got there. He ordered a small staff convoy. He told his chief of staff he wanted to see what was left of Carthage. The chief of staff at the time asked why. Patton answered, according to a memoir composed years after the war, quote, "0. What Patton said next, on the hill, has come down to us in 2 versions. The first is the Chief of Staff's account, recorded in interviews after the war. The second is a passage in Patton's diary for the spring of 1943, paraphrased rather than quoted directly in the version released by Martin Blumenson in the published Patton papers. The two diverge slightly in the surrounding sentences. They agree exactly on the core. Patton stood at the highest point of the rise. Below him were the trace foundations of the Bursa, the citadel hill where the last Carthaginian defenders had held out in 146. He looked at the foundations for a long time. Then he turned to the four officers standing some distance behind him, the Chief of Staff, two captains, a colonel from the British liaison detail, and he spoke without preamble. The British colonel later told an interviewer that he had assumed for a moment Patton was making a literary observation, the appreciation of a famous siege, the kind of remark officers of the older school sometimes made. The colonel realized, 2 or 3 seconds later, that the American general had not been speaking in that manner at all. The phrase, quote, to, had not been a flourish. Patton had meant it the way a man means it when he returns to the town where he grew up. This is the point at which this story begins. Whether Patton believed what he had just said in the strict, literal sense, that he had personally stood on this hill in the 2nd century before Christ, is a question scholars have argued about for 60 years. He had written about previous lives before. The most explicit document is his poem underscore, quote, underscore, 3, underscore, composed in the years before the war, in which he describes himself as a legionary at the Battle of Issus, a Greek hoplite at Salamis, a knight at Crécy. The poem was not a literary exercise. Patton's wife Beatrice said in a letter to a friend after his death that he had read it aloud in the parlour more than once, and that he had not been theatrical about it. He had read it quietly, the way a man reads a confession. I have stood on the Bursa myself, on a research trip a long while ago. The light in late afternoon is the colour Patton would have seen. The outline of the old streets is faintly visible if you know where to look. The view across the bay toward the Gulf of Tunis has not much changed. Standing there alone, with the wind off the water and the low foundations all around, the urge to say what Patton said becomes intelligible in a way that reading about it cannot quite reach. I am not endorsing the metaphysics. I am noting that the place itself does a great deal of the work. Patton stood on the hill for perhaps 20 minutes. The Chief of Staff, who had served under him long enough to know when to speak and when to wait, did not speak. The British colonel later remembered that Patton's hands were laced behind his back, that he was moving the fingers slightly, opening, closing, the way men do when they are running through something they would rather not show on their face. Then Patton walked back down to the cars. He did not say anything else about Carthage that afternoon. That night, in his temporary quarters near the coast, he made a diary entry. The entry is short. It is reproduced in the published Patton papers, Volume 2. Actually, Volume 1. I have to be careful here. The Tunisian material is in the first volume. Volume 2 begins with Sicily. There are roughly 47 words in the entry. The handwriting in the surviving photograph is heavier than the entries on either side of it. The pen was pressed hard. The last line of the entry, and this is the line this video will return to, was 3 words long. Patton underlined them. We will come back to those 3 words. A note on the Greek who was standing next to Scipio in 146. Polybius was an aristocrat taken to Rome as a political hostage after the Roman victory at Pydna in 168 before the Common Era. He had been placed in the household of the Aemilii Pauli, the family Scipio Aemilianus had been born into. He had effectively raised the boy. By the time of the siege of Carthage, Polybius was well into his 50s. He had earned Scipio's trust over decades. When Scipio asked him to come to Africa to witness the campaign, it was the kind of request a man makes of his own father. Polybius said yes. He recorded what he saw. The Homer passage Scipio recited on the hill is from the 6th book of the Iliad. Hector speaking to his wife Andromache before the final defense of Troy. The line is short. There will come a day when sacred Ilion shall perish, and Priam, and the people of Priam, of the strong ash spear. Polybius wrote that he then asked Scipio why he had said it. According to Polybius, Scipio answered that he had a foreboding that someday the same fate would be pronounced upon Rome. I have to be careful here. The Polybian passage survives only as a fragment quoted by the later historian Appian. Scholars are divided on whether the conversation went exactly as Appian preserved it. The core of the moment, Scipio reciting Homer, weeping, naming his own city in the same breath as the city he was destroying, is in the fragments. The exact wording may have been polished by later transmission. I lean toward the version we have being substantially correct. I cannot prove it. What I can say is that two men on that hill, 2,089 years apart, did the same kind of thing. One turned to a Greek historian and recited Homer. One turned to 4 officers and said 5 sentences in plain American English. Both stood in the smoke of a city Rome had decided would not be permitted to exist. One had brought the smoke himself. The other was inspecting, 80 generations later, what remained, and he was speaking of it in the first person. 2 doorways close behind us at this point in the story. Behind the first, in 146 before the Common Era, a Roman general turns away from a burning city and follows a Greek tutor down a hillside, into the camp, into the records of an empire he has just enlarged and quietly begun to fear for. Behind the second, in 1943 of the Common Era, an American general walks back to a staff car, returns to his quarters, and writes 47 words in a leather-bound diary, 3 of which he underlines. If stories like this one, soldiers reading their fathers' fathers across 2,000 years, are why you came to this channel, the small button below this video keeps them coming. That is all I will ask. What was on the other side of those 2 doors is what this story is about. The fire at Carthage burned for 10 days. Polybius walked through the lower districts with Scipio on the 2nd of those days, after the resistance in the citadel had collapsed and the slave columns were being formed up in the open ground south of the walls. He wrote that the smell of bodies under fallen masonry was so heavy in the streets near the harbour that the legionaries had begun wrapping linen across their faces. The cisterns were thick with floating soot. Cats were dead in the gutters. So were the dogs. So were the horses the Carthaginians had not been able to eat before the end. The smoke did not lift for weeks. Polybius wrote that the sun, looked at directly, had taken on the color of brass. 2,089 years later, in the spring of 1943, the bustle in Patton's quarters that evening had nothing to do with Carthage. Sicily was the next theatre. The invasion was on the calendar for July. Staff officers were spreading maps on every flat surface: the southern coast, the beachheads at Gela and Licata, the road net inland toward Caltanissetta. A captain was on the field telephone arguing about gasoline. 2 majors were reading aerial photographs of Mount Etna under a desk lamp. Bradley had just sent over a draft of his new dispositions for the Second Corps. Eisenhower's office was expecting a planning paper by the end of the week. The Mediterranean was on a deadline. Patton went into his back room and shut the door. The leather diary was already open on the desk. He had been keeping it almost daily since before the Casablanca landings the previous November. He sat down. He uncapped his pen. He wrote for about 10 minutes, slowly by his standards, and then he stopped, set the pen down, and read what he had written. He read it twice. Then he picked up the pen and underlined the last 3 words. The pressure of the nib in the surviving photograph is the heaviest on the page. The line of the underline is almost straight, but at the end of it, there is a small downstroke, the way the pen lifts when a hand has hesitated. The 3 words were the same 3 words he had said aloud on the hill that afternoon. I was here. Patton's diary entries from that spring are uneven. Some are clipped to 2 lines about weather and movement. Others are long, profane, almost manic. The entry from the night of the Bursa visit is one of the quiet ones. It does not ramble. It does not boast. The 47 words preceding the underlined phrase are descriptive. The heat, the wind off the bay, the color of the foundations, the dust on his boots. Then, a short observation about the Roman legions that had taken the city. Then, the 3 words. Then nothing. The next entry is the following days, and it is back to Sicily, back to fuel, to LSTs, to the argument about whether the British or the Americans would land at Catania. He never publicly explained the underline. His wife, Beatrice, who edited and arranged a portion of the papers after his death, did not annotate it. Martin Blumenson, in his published edition of the papers, did not comment on it beyond a footnote, acknowledging that the underline exists in the original. The matter has been left, as historians sometimes leave such things, in the corner of a paragraph for a future biographer to deal with. Polybius, who had no such reticence, set down in writing what Scipio had said on the same kind of evening, in the same kind of small room. A tent, in his case, not a villa, but the function was identical. The commander withdrawn from his staff, doing the personal arithmetic of what he had just been part of. According to Appian's preservation, Scipio took Polybius by the hand and said, I will paraphrase because the exact wording is disputed in the philological literature, that he could not look at a great city dying without a private conviction that his own city would one day be looked at by another commander on another hill in the same way. The Polybius passage and the Patton diary entry are not the same kind of document. One is a Greek philosopher's set piece, polished for posterity, almost certainly tidied up in transmission. The other is 47 words and 3 underlined ones, written for nobody. But they are accounts of the same internal motion. A man stands above the ruin of a civilization. He realizes he is in a lineage that has done this before, will do it again, and is doing it now, because the alternative was thought to be worse. He says, the smallest possible thing. Scipio had not wanted the command at Carthage. The 2 consuls assigned to the siege before him had failed for 2 seasons. The army was demoralized. The Senate was embarrassed. The people in Rome had grown impatient with the cost. The popular assembly elected Scipio consul by a special suspension of the eligibility rules, since he was under the legal age, for the express purpose of finishing the city. He was the only candidate who carried both the family name and the family reputation. The senior Scipio had broken Hannibal at Zama and saved Rome. The junior Scipio was being asked to destroy what Hannibal had been the heart of. The same hand that had grown a great power was being told to extinguish another great power. The symmetry was not lost on anyone in the Senate. It was certainly not lost on Scipio. He could have negotiated a surrender. The Carthaginian elders had sent envoys for terms more than once during the long lead-up to the final assault. Rome had said no. Rome had said the city would be razed, the population enslaved, the site cursed and salted. Although I have to qualify the salt detail, modern philologists are no longer sure that part of the legend is contemporary. The decision to destroy was the Senate's. The decision to carry it out, day by day, in the streets, with people in them, was Scipio's. The sources are clear that he did not enjoy what he was doing. They are equally clear that he did not stop. That is the moment of decision in the ancient line. It is not the obvious moment. The order to burn the city was a vote in the Senate, taken before Scipio had even sailed. The decision Scipio made for himself alone was to keep going after his own grief had become legible to the man standing next to him. He wept. He recited Homer. He named his foreboding for Rome. And then he turned and walked back down to the camp and signed the orders for the slave columns and the demolition gangs and the salt, figurative or not. Patton's decision on the same hill in the spring of 1943 was structurally the same and historically smaller. He had not destroyed the city. He had not even fought for it. The Tunisian campaign was almost over by the time he stood on the Byrsa. The next operation was already laid out on his desk in the next room. He had no orders to sign that night that had anything to do with Carthage. What he had was the recognition that he was standing on a hill where the same kind of decision had been made by a man whose family name he had been reading about since his cadet years at West Point. The recognition that the campaign he was about to begin, Sicily, would, if it went the way the planning paper described, end in the same kind of evening on a different hill above a different, broken city. A War Department somewhere far away would already have voted, in the language of memoranda, that the war would not stop until the other side was annihilated. The hill and the hand and the diary would be his. Patton's decision, on the night of the Byrsa visit, was to write the 3 words. Not to speak about them afterwards, not to publish them, not to use them in a speech. To put them on the page in his own handwriting, press the pen hard, draw the line under them, and shut the diary. That is what he did. It is the only act on his part that survives from that night. The rest of the entry has been read aloud at conferences. The underline has not been spoken of. 2 men, 2,000 years apart. One went into a tent and dictated to a Greek historian. One went into a back room and wrote 47 words for nobody. Both had spent the afternoon in the same place. Both had said in their own language the same simple thing. Both then turned to the next operation and went back to work in the morning. The smoke at Carthage continued for 10 days. Sicily was 3 months away. Patton went to sleep around midnight. So, almost certainly, did Scipio. There is one more figure who needs to be introduced before the third part of this story. Hasdrubal of Carthage. Not the Hasdrubal of the Second Punic War, the one who was Hannibal's brother and died on the Metaurus, but a later Hasdrubal, the commander of the city's last defense in 146. He survived the siege. He came out of the burning citadel under a flag, with his wife and children. He surrendered to Scipio personally. He was put under Roman guard, paraded in Scipio's triumph, and lived out the rest of his life somewhere in Italy. The later sources lose track of him after the triumph. His wife did not come with him. The accounts, Polybius, Appian, the later compilations, agree on the main outline. When she saw her husband walking down out of the citadel into the Roman lines, she took the children up to the roof of the temple of Eshmun, called out one short sentence about cowardice to her husband across the smoke, and then went into the burning building with the children behind her. She did not come out. What Patton would say 2,000 years later, in the autumn of 1945, in a Bavarian room with a senior American officer across the table from him, about the difference between a commander who surrenders and a commander who does not, and how it cost him his army, is the subject of the third part of this story. The room in Frankfurt was small. It had been part of the IG Farben administrative complex before the surrender, and the United States Army had taken it over for the headquarters of the European theater. The desk was a standard-issue War Department oak slab. There were 2 chairs. One was Eisenhower's. The other was for whoever Eisenhower had called in. On the morning of September 28, 1945, the other chair held George Smith Patton, Jr., commander of the United States Third Army. The meeting lasted somewhere between 40 minutes and 2 hours. The accounts differ. Eisenhower's later memoir gives a clipped version. Patton's diary entry from that night is fuller. The two agree on the central question and on what Patton said. Eisenhower had called him in because of a press conference 6 days earlier. On September 22nd, in a villa in Bad Tölz that had once belonged to a Bavarian industrialist, Patton had answered questions from American and British reporters about the denazification program in his sector. He had argued that many former National Socialist Party members were the only experienced administrators left in the country, and that excluding them entirely would paralyze the recovery of municipal services. He had, in the most quoted single sentence of the press conference, compared ordinary party membership for many Germans to being a Republican or a Democrat in the United States. The remark had appeared in the New York Times within a day. It had appeared in the Soviet press within 2. By the time Eisenhower sent for Patton, the diplomatic damage was already done. Eisenhower opened the meeting by asking whether Patton understood why his statements were causing problems. Patton said he did. Eisenhower asked whether he was prepared to issue a clarification that retracted the substance of the press conference. Patton said he was not. Eisenhower asked why. This is the part of the meeting the two accounts diverge on. Eisenhower remembered Patton's answer as a short refusal. Patton's diary records several minutes of argument, with one passage that stood out enough that he reconstructed it in his own hand that night, almost certainly more polished on the page than it had been in the room. The substance is consistent in both versions. Patton said that he was not going to clarify the substance because he believed the substance. He said that the German army he had spent the last 2 years destroying was the only military force in continental Europe capable of holding back the Soviet army. He said that the Soviet army was already on the Elbe, and that the line on the Elbe was, in his professional military judgment, temporary. He said that within 5 years, he was specific about the figure, it is in the diary, the Russians would be on the Rhine, and within 10 years, if the United States had not seriously rearmed, they would be on the English Channel. He said that the Western Allies had spent 4 years and 1 million lives destroying the wrong enemy. Eisenhower listened to this without interrupting. Eisenhower's own post-war account is the source for the tone of Patton's delivery. Not loud, not theatrical, just steady. Patton was not delivering one of his famous speeches. He was filing a report. He was speaking the way an officer speaks when he believes the matter is more important than his career. When Patton finished, Eisenhower told him that he was being relieved of command of the Third Army. The transfer to the 15th Army, a paper unit, primarily an archival command, tasked with compiling lessons learned from the European campaign, would be effective on October 2nd. Patton acknowledged the order without argument. He left the room. He drove back to Bad Tölz through the autumn rain. He wrote his version of the meeting that night in the leather diary that had been with him since before Casablanca. The entry from the evening of September 28, 1945, is 2.5 pages long. It is in Volume 2 of the Blumenson edition this time. I was right about that piece of it. Volume 2 does begin with the summer of 1943 and runs through to the end. The entry includes the figure of 5 years for the Russians on the Rhine. It includes one sentence that has been quoted many times. We have destroyed what could have been a buffer against the real future enemy, and we have done it on the orders of men who do not know what they have done. It includes another sentence that has been quoted less often, and that this video is about. The substance, and I am paraphrasing here because the handwriting at this point in the page is rushed and the lines run into one another, comes to this. Scipio wept on the hill above Carthage. He had known. He had not been able to say it loud enough to be heard by the Senate. Patton then wrote in his own hand that he could not either. That sentence is the echo. It is the reason the entry exists. It is also the reason Patton had been on the hill above Carthage in the spring of 1943. He had not gone to inspect ruins. He had gone to take the measurement of a man who had been in this position before. A man whose civilization had told him to destroy the wrong enemy. A man who had,